He did not know his own name. That was the first thing Adeline Vale understood when she stepped into the grand chamber of Ashenvale Manor, and found Sorin standing at the center of it, surrounded by shattered crystal and the wreckage of 6 overturned chairs, his white hair loose around his shoulders, his silver eyes searching the room with an expression she had never seen on his face before, raw, unguarded, and terrified. Sorin Ashenvale was never terrified. He was the Duke of the Northern Bloodline, the most ancient living vampire on the eastern seaboard, a creature of devastating power and immovable confidence, who had survived 7 centuries of court intrigue, blood wars and betrayal so layered it would have unmade a lesser being 1,000 times over. He did not tremble, he did not search rooms with frightened eyes, he did not look, as he looked now, like a man who had just awakened in a world that made no sense to him, but he was looking at Adeline, not at Lord Caline, who stood near the fireplace with his sharp jaw set and his ancient hands folded, watching with an expression Adeline did not trust even slightly. Not at Mira, the head of the household staff, who pressed herself against the doorway with her hand over her mouth. Not at the 3 members of the Ashenvale court who had gathered at the far end of the room, their faces a carefully arranged study in concern that did not reach their eyes. He was looking only at Adeline. "You," Sorin said, and his voice was low and raw and stripped of every layer of regal authority that normally armored it. He took 1 step toward her, and the other vampires in the room visibly tensed. "You are the only one I know." The silence that followed was so complete that Adeline could hear her own heartbeat, and she understood, with the clarity of someone who had survived 3 years inside the most dangerous household in the city, that whatever had happened to Sorin Ashenvale in the past hour was not an accident. Someone had done this to him, and that someone was likely standing in this very room. She did not let the fear show on her face. She had learned that lesson in her first week here, when she had arrived as a 22-year-old with a graduate degree in archival history, a mountain of student debt and a desperate need for work that paid enough to cover her mother's medical bills. The position of household archivist and senior maid at Ashenvale Manor had seemed impossibly well paid for what the listing described. She had understood why within 48 hours. You did not work for vampire nobility and survive it with your nerves intact, unless you learned very quickly to keep your face still and your thoughts invisible. She crossed the room towards Sorin with deliberate, unhurried steps, keeping her breathing even, keeping her expression calm, watching with her peripheral vision as Lord Caline shifted almost imperceptibly. Just a fraction of movement, the kind only someone who had spent years observing vampires would notice, the kind that said he was about to intervene. "Lord Caline," she said without looking at him, her voice carrying the tone she had perfected over 3 years, respectful but absolutely immovable. "The Duke is distressed. I would ask that everyone step back and give him space." "That is not your prerogative, human," Caline said, and the word human carried exactly the weight he intended it to. "No," she agreed pleasantly, "but it appears to be the Duke's." She had reached Sorin now, and she looked up at him directly, meeting those silver eyes that held 7 centuries of memory and found themselves suddenly emptied of all of it. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I am here. I am not going to hurt you." Something in Sorin's face shifted. The terror did not disappear, but it receded, the way a tide recedes from shore, slowly, reluctantly, but unmistakably. He looked at her the way a man looks at the only fixed point in a spinning world, and he reached out, and his hand, so pale, so cold, so impossibly strong, closed around her wrist with a gentleness that was almost painful to witness. "Tell me who I am," he said, and Adeline Vale, human archivist and maid to the most powerful vampire in the city, who had spent 3 years cataloguing his history and learning his household, and quietly, dangerously, irrevocably falling in love with him, took a slow breath and said, "Your name is Sorin Ashenvale. You are the Duke of the Northern Bloodline. You are 712 years old, and this is your home, and I am going to help you." Behind her, she heard Lord Caline take a step forward, and she heard the controlled fury in his movement. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Sorin. Whatever trap had been set tonight, she was going to need every piece of knowledge she had spent 3 years accumulating to get them both out of it alive. The story of how Adeline Vale had come to be the only person Sorin Ashenvale recognized when his memory was stripped away was not a story that made simple sense without context. It required understanding what kind of man he had been before, what kind of creature, regal and dangerous, and buried under centuries of necessity, and what the past 3 years of quiet evenings in the archive room had built between them, slowly and without either of them quite meaning for it to happen. She had been hired by the estate's administrative arm, a corporation called Ashenvale Holdings that presented itself to the modern world as a private wealth management firm. The manor itself sat behind a high stone wall in the old part of the city, where the streets still followed their medieval curves and the buildings pressed together in ways that modern urban planning would never permit. From outside, it looked like an aggressively well-maintained historic property. From inside, it was the seat of a vampire court that had operated continuously since the 14th century. Adeline had not known this on her first day. She had suspected something unusual by the end of her first week, confirmed it by the end of her second, and had made the decision to stay by the end of her first month, which was either the bravest or most foolish choice she had ever made, depending on who was judging. Sorin had not sought her out in those early months. He was a duke who moved through his own household like a weather system, powerful, unavoidable, fundamentally indifferent to the details of daily operations. He had a steward for that. He had courtiers and advisors and a network of blood-sworn retainers that stretched across 3 continents. He did not, in those early months, have any particular reason to notice the new human archivist. What changed it was the Valdris correspondence. Adeline had found it buried in a sub-basement archive that had not been properly catalogued in over 60 years. A collection of letters written in archaic Romanian and Venetian Italian, exchanged between Sorin and a vampire named Valdris Morn during a blood war in the 17th century. She had spent 6 weeks translating them, using her knowledge of archival linguistics, and when she brought the translated and annotated volume to Sorin's study, she had not expected him to read it. He had read all of it in one sitting, standing at his window with the city lights below him, and when he turned around, his expression had contained something she had not seen in a vampire before, a genuine, unguarded recognition of being understood. "You translated every evlayer," he had said, and she remembered thinking that his voice was like the sound of something very old and very tired finally being allowed to rest. Including the second language we embedded in the letter spacing. A double alphabet cipher based on a Wallachian dialect variant from the late 1500s, she had confirmed. It took me a while, but the repetition patterns were distinctive. He had looked at her for a long moment. Most archivists I have employed in the past 2 centuries did not bother with the ciphers. Most archivists were not trying to understand what you were actually saying, she had replied, and she had meant it as a professional observation. But something in the way he heard it had made his silver eyes go very still and very attentive. That had been the beginning of the evenings in the archive. It became a pattern that neither of them had formally established. Sorin arriving in the archive after his court obligations were concluded for the night, usually past midnight, finding Adeline still working, and the 2 of them falling into conversation about the documents she was cataloguing. History, language, the mechanics of blood law, the politics of the vampire courts in centuries past. She was curious without being reckless. He was guarded, but she had come to believe, genuinely lonely, in the way that only someone who has outlived everyone who ever truly knew them can be lonely. She had not been foolish enough to misread it. He was a duke, she was a maid. The distance between their citizens and the hierarchy of his world was so vast as to be nearly cosmological, and yet the conversations had continued, and they had deepened. And somewhere in the second year, she had understood that she was no longer in danger of falling in love with him. She had already fallen. She had done nothing with that understanding. It was not a thing that could be acted on, and Adeline Vale was too intelligent to destroy something real by reaching for something impossible. She had kept working. She had kept the evenings in the archive. She had kept her face still and her heart carefully locked. And then someone had stripped Sorin's memory away on a Tuesday evening in October, and the first and only thing he had recognized in the wreckage of himself was her. The chamber had emptied at her quiet insistence. With Sorin's hand still around her wrist, making it very difficult for anyone to argue the point without risking his instinctive reaction. And even in his current state, even stripped of every memory, the raw power of him was something every vampire in the room felt in their blood. Kalen had left with his expression carefully controlled, which told her more than any words could have. Mira had gone to fetch water and the restorative tinctures kept in the medical stores, which gave Adeline a few minutes alone with Sorin before anyone else returned. She guided him to the long settee near the fireplace and sat beside him, and he kept her wrist in his hand with that terrible gentleness, as though releasing her would mean losing the only anchor he had. "Tell me about the room," she said, keeping her voice even and low. "What do you remember?" He looked around the chamber slowly. His silver eyes were shadowed, the way a fire goes low when the fuel is nearly spent. "Stone walls, behind the plaster," he said. "The building is older than it presents itself." He frowned. "I know what stonework is from what century." "How do I know that?" "Because you built this house in the 1600s, she said. "You have a great deal of architectural knowledge." He absorbed this. "And you," he said, his gaze returning to her. "You, I know the way, I know the stone, not information, just recognition, like something carved." He paused. "Why do I know you and not myself?" Adeline had spent the past 10 minutes thinking about exactly this question, and she had arrived at an answer that frightened her considerably. The spell, if it was a spell, if it was an alchemical working, if it was whatever weapon had been used against him, had stripped away his declarative memory, his history, his sense of self. But it had not stripped away the deeper layer, the thing that lived below knowledge. Emotion. Attachment. The things that had been written into him not as information but as feeling. He did not remember her name. He did not remember their conversations. But he recognized her with something older and more fundamental than memory, and that told her something about what she had meant to him that she had not known before. She filed that knowledge away carefully, because this was not the time to feel it. This was the time to think. "There are people in this house who will try to use your current state," she said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "Lord Kalen, possibly, others. They will tell you things about yourself that are designed to serve their interests. I need you to understand that before they come back." Sorin looked at her steadily. His thumb moved once, almost imperceptibly, against the inside of her wrist. "You are telling me not to trust them." "I am telling you to be cautious," she said. "And I am telling you to trust your instincts even now. You know who I am in the part of you they could not erase. Your instincts about people were never wrong in 3 years. Do not let them be wrong now." 3 years, he repeated slowly. "We have known each other 3 years. Yes." He looked at their joined hands, and something moved through his expression that she recognized. It was the expression he wore when a piece of historical evidence confirmed something he had already suspected. "Then you know a great deal about me," he said. "More than almost anyone," she agreed. "I have spent 3 years translating your history." "And what kind of man am I?" he asked, and the question was so honest, so stripped of pride, that she felt it like a physical ache. She answered him the way she would have answered him in the archive, without out-softening and without cruelty. "You are deeply intelligent and deeply private. You are patient in ways that would seem inhuman to most people, which is perhaps fitting. You are protective of the things and people you consider yours with a ferocity that has occasionally frightened me. You have a capacity for loyalty that is absolute and a capacity for ruthlessness that matches it. You have done things in your history that were necessary and terrible, and you carry them, and you have never used the excuse of necessity to pretend they were not terrible." She paused. "You are the most honorable creature I have ever met, which is also the most dangerous thing about you, because your code of honor operates on a scale, and with a complexity that most people cannot perceive until it is already protecting them or already destroying them." Sorin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And you are not afraid of me?" "I am extremely afraid of the situation," she said honestly. "I am not afraid of you." He released her wrist then, and she felt the absence of his hand like a drop in temperature. "Then tell me about Lord Kalen," he said. She had been waiting for this, and she was ready. Kalen Drast was not formally part of the Ashenvale bloodline. He was a vampire of the Eastern Court, old and powerful in his own right, who had inserted himself into the Ashenvale inner circle 14 months ago. under the pretense of a diplomatic alliance. Adeline had never trusted him. She had spent her first 6 months cataloguing the historical precedents for vampires as using diplomatic proximity as a vector for court takeover, and the pattern she saw in Kaelan was one she recognized from at least 4 historical cases, all of them ending badly for the host household. She had tried to express this concern to Sorin 8 months ago, laying out the historical parallels with the careful precision of someone presenting an archival case. He had listened with full attention and said that he was aware of Kaelan's ambitions, and that he preferred to manage them from a position of knowledge rather than expulsion. What she had not known, what she was only now understanding, was that Kaelan had been planning something more drastic than a political maneuver. Lord Kaelan arrived in this city as a representative of the Eastern Accord, she told Sorin, keeping her voice low and factual, 14 months ago. He has been working steadily since then to position himself as an indispensable advisor. 3 months ago, he began pushing for changes to the Ashenvale blood law succession protocols, specifically the provision that prevents a non-bloodline vampire from assuming custodial control over the Duke's holdings in the event of the Duke's incapacitation. Sorin's eyes sharpened. Even stripped of memory, the intelligence behind them was immediate and precise. If I am incapacitated and unable to assert my authority, and the succession protocol is changed, then custodial control could pass to him, she confirmed. He arranged this, Sorin said. It was not a question. I believe so, but belief is not evidence, and evidence is what we need before you act. If you act on suspicion and you are wrong, or if you act and he has positioned the evidence to look as though the attack originated elsewhere, you will have damaged alliances that your court depends on. She met his eyes. I know the archive. I know where the documentation is. If Kaelan has been planning this, there will be a trail, contracts, communications, financial movements. Give me time to find it. And while you find it, he asked. You let them believe the memory loss is more complete than it is, she said. You learn nothing. You recognize no one. You are confused and disoriented and manageable. You give me room to work. Sorin was silent for 3 seconds. Then he said, You are asking me to perform helplessness. Yes. For a human maid, he said, and the phrase was not dismissive. It was assessing, the way he assessed historical documents, turning them for the angle that revealed their full dimensions. For the person who currently knows more about your household, your history and your enemies than anyone else in this building, she corrected, gently, but without apology. Something shifted in his face. Something that looked, in the firelight, like the very beginning of a smile. It was the expression she had seen in the archive on the nights when she had said something that surprised him into genuine amusement. The expression that had made her fall in love with him, the way a person falls from a great height, without quite realizing it was happening until the ground was already very close. Then I will learn nothing and remember no one, he said, and you will find me my evidence. What followed was the most exhausting and terrifying week of Adeline Vale's life, and she had spent the previous 3 years doing things she would have classified as terrifying. She moved through the manor with the inevitable efficiency she had spent years developing, cataloguing and cleaning and keeping her head down, while Sorin played the role of a man hollowed out by memory loss with a skill that surprised her. Or perhaps it should not have surprised her, because he had survived 7 centuries of court politics, which required a comprehensive understanding of how to be exactly what your enemies needed you to be. He was confused and childlike in his interactions with the court. He asked simple questions. He deferred to Kaelan on matters of household management with a passivity that must have delighted Kaelan down to his bones. Adeline watched Kaelan's controlled satisfaction from her peripheral vision every time she moved through a room he occupied, and she catalogued it the same way she catalogued everything, as evidence, as data, as something she would use. The nights were different. After the court retired, after Kaelan withdrew to his chambers, in the East Wing, Adeline would make her way to the archive under the pretext of night cataloguing, and Sorin would come to her. She did not know how he found her consistently in the beginning, and when she asked him, he said only that he had no memory, but that some things apparently did not require memory. He said it without particular emphasis. Looking at a document she had spread across the reading table, and she did not let herself look at him for a moment, because the emotion she felt at the plain simplicity of that statement was something she could not afford to show. She was building a case. The archive contained 60 years of Ashenvale financial and correspondence records, and she knew it better than any living person, better certainly than the vampires who had allowed it to accumulate without consistent cataloguing. She worked through the night with the focused intensity that had made her exceptional at her work from the very beginning. And she found things. She found a contract bearing Kaelin's seal dated 9 months prior, establishing a financial arrangement with a practitioner of blood alchemy, the ancient and largely outlawed discipline that used concentrated blood magic to manipulate the neurological architecture of vampires. Memory suppression was among the oldest and most reliable applications. The contract was written in careful legal language that obscured its purpose, but Adeline had spent 3 years with Sorin's historical records, and she recognized the language of evasion the same way she recognized cipher patterns. She found communication threads between Kaelin and 3 members of the Eastern Accord Council, indicating that they expected a formal succession transfer from Ashenvale to Kaelin's custody within the month. She found, most damningly, a modified version of the Ashenvale blood law succession document, bearing a seal that she recognized as legitimate, the seal used by the court's official record keeper, a vampire named Thessaly, who served on the inner council and whom Adeline had always found unusually attentive to Kaelin's presence at council meetings. She brought these findings to Sorin on the 4th night, spreading them across the archive table in order, and he read them with the focused silence of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at, even without the memories that context would have provided. "Thessaly," he said when he reached the modified succession document. "Yes," she said. "And if I understand blood law correctly." He paused, and she saw him work through it the way he worked through everything now, from principles rather than from memory. A succession document bearing the seal of the court record keeper is legally binding under the old codes, even if I recover my memory, even if I contest it, unless the document was created under fraudulent conditions, she said. Which this was. Blood alchemy, to induce incapacitation for the purpose of triggering succession, would constitute a prohibited act under the covenant that governs vampire courts internationally, but proving it requires the testimony of a recognized court authority, which means, "We cannot use Thessaly," he said, "and Kaelin controls enough of the inner council that any authority convened in this city would be compromised." He looked at her. There is an alternative. She had been waiting to see if he would arrive at it. "The High Tribunal," she said. "Yes," he straightened from the table. "The International Blood Law Authority, uncontrollable by any single court, and their jurisdiction supersedes domestic succession law if a covenant violation is demonstrated." He studied her. "Do you know how to make a formal petition to the tribunal?" "I spent yesterday evening reading the protocols in the 1792 covenant correspondence," she said. "Yes, but the petition requires a blood signature from the aggrieved party, and it requires us to get it to a tribunal receiver without Kaelin intercepting it." Sorin looked at the document in front of him for a long moment. "There is a receiver in this city," he said slowly. "An office maintained by the tribunal for exactly this kind of emergency. I do not remember where it is." He pressed his fingers briefly to the bridge of his nose in a gesture that was so recognizable, so precisely the gesture he made in the archive when he was working through a problem, that it hurt to look at. "But I know the name of the office keeper. Receiver Malachite. The name is still there." "I can find a Receiver Malachite," she said. "A city directory. Vampire court rosters are not public, but there are ways to access them if you know what you are looking at." "And Kaelin," Sorin said. "If he discovers what we are doing, then we have a problem," she said directly. "He will not hurt me while you are watching, because whatever state you are currently in, your instinctive response to a threat to me is something he is not prepared to manage. But if he separates us, he will not separate us," Sorin said, and the certainty in his voice was the first time in 4 days that she had heard the full weight of who he was behind the hollow of the memory loss. It was brief and it was controlled, but it was there. The Duke, rising through the damage like bedrock through eroded soil, she allowed herself to look at him for one full unguarded moment, this man she loved without permission. This ancient and dangerous and deeply honorable creature, standing in the lamplight of his own archive, working through the wreckage of his memory, with the same precision and discipline she had spent 3 years admiring from a careful distance. Then she looked back at the documents. Then let us get to work. Finding receiver Malachite took the better part of the following day. Conducted in the stolen minutes between household duties, while Adeline maintained the appearance of her normal routine. Malachite was listed in a vampire court administrative directory that she accessed through the archive's research subscriptions. A name and an address in the old city, a basement office beneath an antiquarian bookshop, 3 blocks from the manor. The difficulty was reaching it. Sorin could not walk openly through the city in his current state without Kaelin's people tracking his movements. And sending Adeline alone was a risk she could see Sorin calculating against from the moment she mentioned it, his jaw tightening in the way it did when he was managing a response that he preferred not to show. "You cannot come with me in daylight," she said, because the truth was always better stated plainly. "And the bookshop closes at 9, which is still half an hour before civil twilight this time of year." He looked at her. "I can manage 30 minutes past twilight." "That is not." She stopped. She knew his sunlight tolerance. She had catalogued the historical records on it. Ancient vampires developed significantly higher ultraviolet resistance over centuries. It was not immunity, but Sorin could endure brief exposure at the margins of the day in ways younger vampires could not. 30 minutes at most, she said. "I only need 10, he said. She planned it carefully. They had no allies in the house they could fully trust. Mira had shown concerning deference to Kaelan in the past week, and she was not prepared to make assumptions about the rest of the staff. So she and Sorin left the manor alone. Through the service entrance that let out onto the old alley behind the property, on the following evening at 8:47. With the last arc of sunlight still burning at the horizon, Sorin wore a long coat and moved with his collar turned up and his head angled down, and still Adeline could see the faint tension in him at the light's edge. The controlled containment of an ancient body managing a genuine physical discomfort. She wanted to reach for his hand, and she did not, because they were moving fast and focused, and there was no room for anything else. She had been to the antiquarian bookshop before twice, for research purposes. The owner was a thin older man with an expression of permanent, mild surprise who asked no questions when they entered, and directed them without a word to the staircase at the back. As though escorting a vampire duke and his maid to the basement tribunal office was a perfectly routine occurrence, which, she supposed, it probably was. Receiver Malachite was a vampire of indeterminate age, with close-cropped silver hair and precise dark eyes, who looked at Sorin and Adeline with a careful assessing neutrality and asked them to sit. The formal petition process took 40 minutes. Malachite reviewed the documents Adeline had brought with methodical attention, asked 3 precise questions, and obtained Sorin's blood signature on the petition form, with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and understood that speed was generally in the petitioner's interest. The tribunal will issue an emergency stay on all succession actions pending investigation, Malachite said, sealing the petition. This does not mean Lord Kaelan cannot attempt to execute the fraudulent document before the stay is served. It means that if he does, he will have acted in violation of a tribunal injunction, which is a significantly more serious offence under the blood covenant than the original fraud. He looked at them over his reading glasses. "You should expect the stay to be served within 48 hours. I would advise you to be very careful in the interim." The walk back to the manor was faster. The sun was fully down, and Sorin moved with the ease and quiet power that was his natural state, and Adeline found herself watching him from the corner of her eye. The way he scanned the streets ahead, the precise awareness with which he tracked every other presence in the alley, the way he consistently positioned himself between her and any potential approach vector without appearing to do so deliberately. "You have been doing that since we left the manor," she said. He glanced at her. "Doing what?" "Keeping yourself between me and any direction a threat could come from." A pause. "Is that concerning to you?" "No," she said honestly. "It is deeply habitual. You do it in the archive as well. You always sit with your back to the wall and my chair closest to the door." Another pause, and she knew from the quality of his silence that this was new information to him. Not something he had done consciously, but something his body had built into its habits around her, without his mind's formal instruction. "I did not know I did that," he said. "I know," she said. "That was rather the point." They were almost back to the manor gate when the attack came. It came from two directions simultaneously, two vampires she had never seen before, moving with the blurring speed of old blood, and a third who appeared from the shadow of the gatehouse itself. She had time to understand that they were not Ashenvale's people, that they wore the discreet insignia of the Eastern Accord, and that Kaylan had clearly decided the petition risk was too great to wait. Sorin moved before she had finished the thought. She had read about his capabilities in the historical records. She had catalogued accounts of his abilities from 3 centuries of documentation. She had understood intellectually that the Duke of the Northern Bloodline was among the most dangerous fighting vampires in the Western courts. None of that had fully prepared her for the reality of watching him move. He was a controlled, devastating force, and even with his memory stripped, even running on instinct and reflex, he was extraordinary. The first attacker he put down so efficiently that Adeline barely tracked the sequence of it. The second took longer and left a long cut on Sorin's forearm that she saw, and that she filed for later with a spike of cold fear she did not show. The third attacker moved toward Adeline, and the sound Sorin made in response was the only moment in the entire fight where she heard something other than controlled precision. It was a sound of absolute, unambiguous refusal, the sound of something ancient and territorial and ferociously protective, and the third attacker stopped moving almost immediately. Reconsidering what they had judged to be the easier target, the altercation was over in under 2 minutes. Sorin stood in the middle of the alley, with 3 of Kaylan's people on the ground and blood on his coat sleeve, and his silver eyes luminous with the particular cold light she had read about but never seen, and he looked at Adeline with an expression that was not about the fight at all.
"Are you hurt?" he said.
"No," she said. "Are you?" He looked at his arm as though he had not noticed the cut. "It is minor," he said. "That is not the same as not being hurt," she said. Something in his expression shifted. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the first moments after the memory loss. That particular recognition that went below knowledge, below history, below everything that had been taken from him. And he crossed the distance between them, and his hand came up and touched her face with a gentleness so complete and so unguarded that she stopped breathing. "I know why you are the only thing I remember," he said quietly. "Sorin," his name on her lips for the first time. Not Your Grace, not the Duke, but his name. And she saw him feel it, saw it move through him like light through glass. "Not now," he said, and there was a softness in his voice that matched his hands. "You are right that this is not at the time. But I needed you to know that I know." She held his gaze for one long moment and she said nothing, and that was its own answer. They went inside. The tribunal stay arrived in 31 hours. Served by a tribunal representative who appeared at the manor door at 9:30 the following evening while Kaylan was conducting what amounted to an informal court session in the main hall. Laying the groundwork for the succession transfer he planned to execute the following morning, Adeline was in the hall, maintaining her role when the tribunal representative arrived. She watched Kaylan receive the stay documentation with the perfectly controlled stillness of a man who was extremely good at not showing that the situation had just reversed catastrophically under his feet. He read the document twice. He looked at the representative. He looked around the room with eyes that moved quickly, searching for the source of the petition. His gaze found Adeline. She held it without expression for 3 full seconds, and then she turned and continued her duties, and that was the entirety of what she allowed herself in the way of satisfaction. The subsequent 3 days were a careful, complicated unraveling. The tribal investigation moved with the efficiency of an authority that had 6 centuries of practice, managing exactly this kind of covenant violation. They descended on the manor with a team of investigators and an authority that overrode every piece of legal maneuvering Kaylan's supporters attempted. Thessaly, faced with the evidence of the altered succession document bearing her seal, broke her loyalty to Kaylan on the second day of questioning and provided a full account of his arrangements. The blood alchemist Kaelan had contracted was located in the city within 48 hours and brought before the tribunal under conditions that were not pleasant for him, and he corroborated the commission of the memory suppression, working in enough specific detail that the legal case was unambiguous. The working itself, this was the question that mattered most. The one Adeline had been holding at the back of her mind since the first night was reversible. Not all blood alchemic memory suppressions were. Some operated by destruction rather than suppression, and those were permanent. But Kaelan had needed Sorin manageable, not gone, because a dead duke created complications that an incapacitated one did not. The alchemist had used a suspension working, layering a false neural absence over Sorin's actual memories rather than destroying them. Reversing it required the alchemist's cooperation, a significant volume of the specific compound he had used, and a tribunal-sanctioned practitioner to administer the reversal. It took 4 days to arrange. Those 4 days were quiet in a way that felt suspended, like the held breath before a moment that cannot be undone. The court had largely withdrawn, Kaelan's people pulling back under tribunal oversight, the inner council waiting to see how the situation resolved. Sorin continued to manage the household from his concurrent state with a precision that steadily improved as his instincts filled in more of what his memory could not supply, and Adeline continued her work, and they met in the archive in the evenings, and they talked. These were different conversations from the ones they had had in the 3 years before. They were not about history or documents or the politics of centuries past. They were about everything closer and harder to name, the things that had accumulated between them in 3 years of evenings and never been said, because neither of them had found the way to say them within the distance that propriety and station required. He told her what it had been like to wake in the chamber with the memory gone. Not terrifying, he said, but not in the way she might expect. It had been empty in the way a room is empty before the furniture is put in, and then he had seen her, and the room had not been empty anymore. She told him that she had known she loved him, since the evening he had spent 45 minutes carefully explaining the political context of the 1618 Blood War, because she had mentioned finding the records confusing, and he had, without any apparent self-consciousness about the gesture, sat down across the reading table from her and walked her through all of it, as though her understanding of it mattered deeply to him. She told him she had spent 18 months after that evening, finding increasingly meticulous reasons why nothing could be done about it, and why it was better that way. Sorin had listened to this with perfect stillness, the way he listened to everything she said, and then he had said, with a precision that was also somehow tender, "How many of those reasons do you still believe?" And she had said honestly, "Fewer than I did a week ago." On the 5th day, in the late afternoon, the tribunal practitioner administered the reversal in the manor's medical chamber. Adeline was not in the room. It was a medical procedure, and she was not caught, and there were appropriate attendants. And she spent the hour before it was completed in the archive, sitting at the reading table, not reading anything, acknowledging to herself that she was frightened, not for his safety. The practitioner was sanctioned and competent, and the procedure was well documented. She was frightened of something smaller and larger at the same time. She was frightened that when Sorin had all of himself back, the Sorin who had said, "I know why you are the only thing I remember," would be covered over again by the 7 centuries of careful aristocratic armor, the formal distance, the Duke of the Northern Bloodline who had every reason in the world not to cross the line between them. She was frightened that the man she had been talking to in the evenings for the past week was partly a product of the memory loss. Freed from his own history, freed from the layers of who he was supposed to be, and that the restoration would be a kind of loss in a sense also. She heard his footstep in the corridor before he opened the archive door, and she recognized it the way she recognized every specific thing about him, and she took a breath and looked up. He stood in the doorway. He was himself again. She could see it in the way he held his body, the full authority of it, the composed and ancient dignity restored. The silver eyes were clear and steady and fully present. He was the Duke, entirely, returned to himself. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked into the room, and he sat down across the reading table from her, in the chair he had always occupied, and he said, "The Valdris correspondence." You translated the double cipher in the letter spacing using a Wallachian dialect variant from the late 1500s. Yes, she said, her voice steady. You told me I carry what I have done without using necessity as an excuse, he said. Yes, and you told me I was the most honorable creature you had ever met, which was also the most dangerous thing about me. He paused. I remember all of it, Adeline, not because the week gave it to me. I remember it because it was already there, and it has been there for longer than I allowed myself to acknowledge, which is a failure of honesty that I find I am no longer willing to maintain. She was quiet, because she did not trust herself to speak without saying too much or too little. I am aware of what I am, he said. I am aware of the distance between us in terms of everything this world uses to measure distance. Age, station, nature. I have used those distances deliberately because I was uncertain whether what I felt was what I believed it to be, or whether it was something more self-serving that I had dressed in the language of what I believed it to be. He looked at the table surface for a moment, the gesture of a man choosing his words with the precision he applied to everything. The week removed the option of using uncertainty as a barrier. Without my memory, I had nothing but what I actually felt, and what I actually felt from the first moment I saw you in that chamber was home. The word landed in the silence between them with a weight that made the air feel different. Sorin, she said quietly. I know what you will say, he said. You will say that the circumstances were unusual and that a decision made in the absence of full context should not be acted on hastily. You will say that the structural reality of our positions in this household has not changed, and that you have lived carefully within that reality for good reasons. He looked at her steadily. And you will be right about all of that. And I intend to ask you to set it aside anyway, because I have spent 712 years being right about things, and acting accordingly, and the last week has shown me that there is a category of rightness that does not live in facts, and that facts can be used to obscure. She felt tears in her eyes, and she was honestly surprised to discover it. She did not cry easily or often, and she had not cried in the entire week of the crisis. Through the danger and the fear and the fighting in the alley and the long exhausted evenings in the archive. But this, the plain and precise and utterly sincere expression of something she had loved from behind a wall of careful distances for 3 years, was apparently what broke through. She did not let the tears fall. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight and she said, I am not going to set aside the structural reality of our positions. He was quiet, and she saw the careful stillness with which he received this. I am going to change it, she said. I am not going to be your maid and find a way to love you around the edges of that. I am not built for the kind of careful love that lives in borrowed evenings and doesn't change anything structural, and neither, I think, are you. She met his eyes fully. If you mean this, if you mean it in the way that your nature means things, which is to say permanently, and with full understanding of what it costs, then I want an equal standing. Not in the court, not overnight. I understand how these things work. But between us, I want to be seen as what I am to you, not managed as a sensitive personnel situation. There was a silence that lasted long enough that she was aware of her own heartbeat. Then Sorin stood up and walked around the reading table and stood before her, and she stood as well because she was not going to look up at him for this. And he was close enough that she could feel the specific temperature of him, cool and steady, the temperature she had catalogued unconsciously over 3 years until it had become the temperature she associated with safety. I have never, he said, with a precision and a gravity that she felt in her chest, in 712 years, asked anyone to share my standing. I have never wanted to. I did not believe I had the capacity for it in the way that you mean. He lifted his hand and touched her face the way he had touched it in the alley, the same absolute gentleness, the same full presence of intention behind it. I am asking you now, not around the edges, not in borrowed evenings, fully. She put her hand over his where it lay against her cheek, and she felt him draw a breath that was not quite steady. And for a moment the 7 centuries and the Duke and the Northern Bloodline and all the formal weight of what he was simply fell away, and he was just Sorin, looking at her as though she was the fixed point in every world he had ever navigated. Then yes, she said simply. He kissed her with the same quality she had come to associate with everything he did. Deliberate, complete, and fully present. There was no hesitation in it and no performance, only the plain and real expression of something that had been accumulating for 3 years, and was finally allowed its full form. When they separated, she was slightly breathless, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Open, satisfied, steady, the expression of something settled. "What happens now with Kaelin?" she asked. Because she was Adeline Vale, and even in moments like this, her mind held the structural question. His expression moved from that open warmth to something sharper and cooler, without losing any of its clarity. "The tribunal will conclude their investigation within the week. Kaelin will be stripped of his Eastern Accord, standing and exiled from the Western courts. Thessaly's cooperation earns her a reduced sanction. She will lose her seal authority but retain her court standing." He paused. "The alchemist will be tried under the full weight of the blood covenant, which is not a comfortable position." "And the succession protocol?" she asked. "Amended," he said. "The fraudulent modification will be voided, and the original protocol will be restored with additional protections that make it significantly harder to alter without tribunal oversight." He looked at her with a slight tilt of his head that was one of his most recognizable expressions, the one that meant he was about to say something with more than its surface meaning. "There will also be a formal record of your role in all of this. Not because you require recognition, but because the record should be accurate." She thought about that for a moment. "In the court records, in the tribunal records," he said, "which are the authoritative ones. What you did, identifying the fraud, constructing the legal case, navigating the petition process under active threat, that was not the work of a household maid. That was the work of someone who should be acknowledged as a court authority in her own right." He paused again. "I would like to make that formal with your agreement, as part of establishing your standing, not for political reasons, because it is accurate." Adeline looked at him for a moment, absorbing this. "An archival authority," she said. "More than that," he said. "The covenant allows for a human consort of a duke to hold a formal court title. It has not been done in this bloodline. It is not commonly done in any bloodline. But the law exists, and I intend to use it if you will allow me to." She was quiet. She understood what he was offering, and she understood the weight of it, the formal, irrevocable, permanent nature of a thing done under blood law, which did not retract and did not equivocate. She thought about her mother's medical bills, which had been manageable now for a year, covered by the salary Sorin's estate paid her. She thought about her work, the archive, the thousands of hours she had spent building something real and useful within these walls. She thought about 3 years of evenings in lamplight, and the particular quality of his attention, and the way he had looked at her in the chamber, with his memory gone as though she was the only real thing left. "Yes," she said again, and she said it the same way she had said it the first time. Simply, without qualification, because she had always been direct when she was sure. The weeks that followed were full of the particular kind of complexity that came with dismantling a court conspiracy and rebuilding the structures it had damaged. The tribunal completed their investigation and handed down their findings, and Kaelin Drast was formally expelled from the Western courts with a thoroughness that made it clear the tribunal considered the blood covenant violation to be among the more serious ones they had adjudicated in recent years. The Eastern Accord, rather than attempting to protect him, formally disavowed his actions with the dispatch that suggested they had not been unaware of his tendencies and had been waiting for them to create consequences they could use. Thessaly surrendered her seal authority without contesting it, and the court's record-keeping was reorganized under new oversight that Adeline helped design, drawing on her archival expertise in ways that made the household's operations significantly more transparent and harder to corrupt. The household itself gradually settled. The staff who had been uncertain about their loyalties in the crisis found that the resolution was comprehensive enough, and the Duke's authority was clearly restored enough that uncertainty resolved into stability. Mira apologized to Adeline directly in the kitchen in a brief and awkward and genuine conversation for the deference she had shown Kaelin in the crisis week. Adeline accepted it without drama. Because the resolution mattered more than the accounting of it, Sorin's memory was entirely intact. The reversal had been complete, and the week of the suppression had not left any permanent damage. The alchemist had been thorough, in his construction of the working, which cut both ways, since the same thoroughness meant the reversal was equally complete. What remained from the week was only what had happened in it, which was more than sufficient, on a cold evening in November. With the city lights below the manor's upper windows and the archive lit by the same lamps that had burned through 3 years of evenings, Sorin presented Adeline with the formal court title document, signed under tribunal witness, making her the first human to hold a formal standing in the Ashenvale court in 4 centuries. She read it carefully, the way she read everything, and then she set it down and looked at him. "Adeline Ashenvale, court archivist and ducal consort," she said. "You did not mention the Ashenvale." "An oversight in the paperwork," he said, and the expression he wore was the one she loved most. The one that was almost entirely composed except for the very faint suggestion, just around the edges, of someone who was quietly, deeply, genuinely happy. "Sorin," she said. "It is a legal document," he said. "It requires accuracy." She looked at him for a moment. The lamplight was warm and the archive was full of the familiar smell of old paper and stone, and the man standing before her was 712 years old and ancient and powerful and completely, honestly hers, looking at her with silver eyes that contained the full weight of the century they had begun together. "It requires accuracy," she agreed. She crossed to him, and his arms came around her with the ease of something that had found its rightful form. And she stood within the circle of them and felt the cool steadiness of him and the perfect settled rightness of it. "I need to finish cataloguing the 1500s diplomatic correspondence," she said into his shoulder. "That will take weeks," he said. "Months, probably," she agreed. "Some of it is in very poor condition." "Then we will need several months of evenings," he said. "At minimum," she said. Outside, the city continued its modern noise and light, completely indifferent to the ancient blood law and the vampire duke and the human woman in the archive below its streets. And the world went on as worlds do, around the fixed and quiet certainty of 2 people who had found, in the specific way that rare things are found, not sought, not forced, but recognized, exactly the thing they had needed, in exactly the form neither of them had expected. She stayed. Of course she stayed. She had made her choice with the same deliberate clarity with which she made every decision that mattered, and she had never, in the months and years that followed, found a reason to unmake it. The archive grew. She expanded it, with Sorin's full and often enthusiastic involvement, into the most comprehensive private collection of vampire historical records in the Western courts, a resource that the tribunal itself eventually requested access to, which Adeline granted under carefully negotiated terms that gave the Ashenvale court considerable goodwill with an authority that tended to be useful. She learned the court. She learned its politics with the same systematic intelligence she brought to archival research, understanding the layers of it, the alliances and the old grudges and the points of pressure, until she could navigate them as well as any vampire born to the system and better than most. Sorin never tried to manage this process or guide it toward particular outcomes. He trusted her judgment with a completeness that still sometimes surprised her, the flat, simple trust of someone who had learned precisely what another person was capable of and adjusted their expectations accordingly. Other courts took notice. A human consort with formal Ashenvale standing who had engineered the defeat of a tribunal-level conspiracy was not someone any of the surrounding courts could afford to dismiss, and several of them found, over time, that attempting to dismiss her was a reliable way of irritating the Duke of the Northern Bloodline to a degree that was diplomatically inconvenient. She attended her first formal court assembly 4 months after the title document, in a gown that Sorin had arranged with the particular quiet attention he brought to things that mattered to him. And she stood at his right hand in the way the title protocol required, and she felt the weight of every ancient and aristocratic gaze in the room, and she met them with the steady, intelligent composure that she had been developing since her first week in the manor. Afterward, in the carriage back to the manor, Sorin had said, "You did not look at anyone in that room with any indication of being intimidated." "I was not intimidated," she had said. "I was the most prepared person in that room, and I knew it." He had looked at her sidelong with that expression, the one that was almost entirely composed, and said, "This is what I mean when I say you are dangerous." She had laughed, genuinely, easily. The laugh she had learned she could have around him, and the sound of it had made him smile, actually smile, which was still among the rarer and more extraordinary things she had the privilege of witnessing. They argued. Because they were both people who thought carefully and held their conclusions with conviction, and sometimes their careful held conclusions pointed in different directions. The arguments were vigorous and specific and completely free of the cruelty that poisons arguments between people who do not fundamentally respect each other. They ended invariably with one or both of them having moved, because they were both capable of changing their minds when the evidence warranted it, which it sometimes did on either side. He was protective in ways that had initially been an adjustment. The territorial attention, the instinctive positioning, the quality of his response when any external threat came near her that communicated, in terms that did not require translation, that this was not a thing that was going to be tolerated. She had not told him to stop, because she had recognized early on that it was not about her incapacity. He knew precisely what she was capable of. The protectiveness was not a statement about her ability to handle herself, and it was a statement about what she meant to him, and those were entirely different things. She had her own version of it. She was thorough in ways that covered his exposures, the political and logistical blind spots that came from 7 centuries of operating as the most powerful entity in any room, which occasionally produced a particular kind of overlooked vulnerability that she tracked and managed, without making a formal announcement of it, because he did not need the announcement. He noticed. He always noticed. They were, as it turned out, extremely good together. The manor itself changed over time. Not physically. The stone was still 17th century. The archive still occupied the same basement rooms. The windows still looked out over the same old city curves, but the quality of life within it was different. Adeline had opinions about household management that were not the opinions of a maid trying to accommodate an employer's preferences, but of a person who lived there fully and intended to keep living there for the foreseeable extent of a human life, and those opinions were heard and acted on with a respect that reshaped the texture of the place over months. She thought, sometimes, about the fact of a human life in a house built for immortals. She was not naive about it. She was 26 now, and Sorin was 712, and the arithmetic of that was not obscure. They had talked about it, directly, as they talked about everything that mattered, on a long, quiet evening in the spring, sitting in the archive, with the windows open to the night air and the city below. "I know what the question is," she had said, "and I know there is an answer to it in the blood law, and I know you are not going to raise it because you believe the choice has to originate from me." He had been quiet for a moment. "Yes," he had said. "Tell me about it," she had said. "All of it. What it involves, what it costs, what it changes, what it does not change." He had told her all of it, with the exhaustive honesty she had always received from him when she asked for the full account of something, and she had listened to all of it and asked the questions she needed to ask, and he had answered every one. She had not made the decision that night. She had thought about it for weeks, carrying it carefully, examining it from the angles she examined every important question. She had thought about her mother, who was healthy now, and who had met Sorin twice, and whose primary reaction to him had been an informed and slightly resigned acknowledgement that her daughter had always had specific tastes in people, and this was simply the most extreme version of that pattern. She had thought about her work and her life, and the specific quality of happiness she had discovered in the manor, which was a happiness she had not expected to find, and had found to be worth considerably more than she had previously understood happiness to be worth. On an evening in late summer, she had come to the archive where Sorin was reading, and she had sat down across from him at the reading table, the way she had sat across from him every evening for 3 years plus all the months since, and she had said, "Yes." He had looked up from the document he was reading. He had known exactly what she meant, because he always knew exactly what she meant, and his expression had been the most completely unguarded she had ever seen on him. Not the edge of happiness, not the almost smile, but the full, plain, open expression of someone receiving something they had hoped for, with a completeness they had not allowed themselves to fully anticipate. "Are you certain?" he had said. I have been thinking about it for 6 weeks, she had said. I am certain. He had stood and walked around the table, and she had stood as well, and he had held her face in both hands and looked at her for a long, full moment with those silver eyes that had been the first thing she had fallen in love with, the intelligence and the careful attention and the depth of them. You are certain, he said, and it was not a question the second time. It was a recognition. Yes, she said, and leaned into him, and felt him hold her with the full, unhurried strength of something that had decided. The procedure was ancient, documented in the archive. She knew better than anyone. She had, in fact, catalogued the specific records herself in the second year, and had spent an evening in quiet inner acknowledgement of the particular irony of that. It was conducted under tribunal witness, as blood covenant procedures of that magnitude required, and it was formal and significant, and took most of a night. And when it was done, and the sun came up over the city, she was still entirely herself, sharp and curious and composed and deeply capable, but the arithmetic had changed. She stood at the window with the dawnlight coming in pale and cold, and felt herself in her own skin the same way she always had. And Sorin stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders and his chin against her hair. And the city below them was going about its early morning entirely indifferent to the fact that in the basement archive of the old manor on the curved medieval street, 3 years of careful distance, and one extraordinary week of crisis, and a love that had grown without permission in the evenings between history and lamplight, had arrived at its proper, permanent, fully resolved form. The 1500s diplomatic correspondence, she said, after a while. She felt his quiet amusement against her hair. Still unfinished, he confirmed. Then I had better get to work, she said. She turned in his arms and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and between them was everything that had been built and earned and survived, the archive, and the evenings, and the crisis, and the choice, and all the long, specific, extraordinary substance of it. Good morning, Adeline Ashenvale, he said. She smiled, full and real and entirely her own. Good morning, Your Grace, she said, and kissed him once, and then pulled free of his arms with the brisk and purposeful energy that was entirely characteristic of her, and went to the archive, where the work was, and the history, and the long and patient and magnificent task of understanding the world they had built together. Behind her, she heard him follow, which was also entirely characteristic of him, and the door to the archive opened, and the city went on, and the story settled into the life it had always been reaching toward.